The sound came at precisely 2:14 a.m. Emily bolted upright in bed, her heart racing as she grabbed her husband's arm. The soft, plaintive wails drifted through the house, carried by the stillness of the night. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Derek groaned, half asleep, and rubbed his face. "What are you talking about?" "Listen." The sound grew louder, unmistakable, a baby crying, a thin, high-pitched wail full of need and sorrow. Derek sat up, his bleary expression sharpening. "Where's that coming from?" he muttered. Emily shook her head, her pulse thundering in her ears. "We don't have a baby." The two of them stared at each other, the words hanging heavily in the air. They had moved into the house 3 weeks ago, a charming fixer-upper in a quiet neighborhood. It was supposed to be their fresh start, a blank slate after years of unsuccessful fertility treatments and mounting frustration. Emily had fallen in love with the nursery room on site, despite knowing it might never be used. Now, her chest tightened as the cries echoed again, piercing and mournful. Derek swung his legs over the side of the bed, grabbing his phone to use its flashlight. "Stay here," he said, his voice low but firm. "Like hell I will." Emily followed him, pulling her robe tight around herself as they stepped into the hallway. The house was dark, shadows pooling in the corners where the flashlight couldn't reach. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, disorienting and unnervingly clear. Derek hesitated outside the nursery door. "It's coming from in there," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Derek nodded, his hand tightening around the doorknob before slowly turning it. The room beyond was as they'd left it, empty save for an old rocking chair that had come with the house, its pale wood scuffed and creaking gently in the night breeze. But the crying stopped the moment they opened the door. Emily stepped inside, scanning the room with wide, anxious eyes. She felt the hair on her arms stand on end, though the air wasn't cold. Something felt off, an almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere, like stepping into a memory that wasn't hers. "There's nothing here," Derek said, though his voice lacked conviction. Emily approached the rocking chair, her hands trembling. It was facing the window, its back turned toward them. Slowly, she reached out and touched it. The wood felt warm, as though someone had been sitting in it moments before. Derek's phone buzzed, making them both jump. He fumbled to silence it, his face pale. "I don't like this," he said. "Neither do I," Emily admitted, backing away from the chair. They returned to their bedroom, locking the door behind them. Neither spoke as they lay in the dark, straining to hear anything else unusual. But the house remained silent, as if mocking their unease. It wasn't until Emily was on the verge of sleep that the crying started again. The crying came back, louder this time, as though it were just outside their door. Emily sat up, clutching Derek's arm again. His eyes were already open, his jaw set. This time, there was no hesitation. He grabbed the baseball bat he kept under the bed and motioned for her to stay behind him. "No way," Emily said firmly. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight. They moved toward the bedroom door, Derek gripping the bat tightly. The crying persisted, a heartbreaking sound that filled Emily with equal parts dread and sorrow. As Derek opened the door, the sound abruptly shifted, as if retreating down the hallway. "It's moving," Emily whispered. They crept toward the sound, their bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The house, once their refuge, now felt foreign and malevolent. Shadows seemed deeper, the corners darker, as if something was watching from just out of sight. The cries led them to the stairs. Derek leaned over the railing, his flashlight cutting through the darkness below. "It's coming from the living room," he said. They descended slowly, each creak of the stairs echoing like a gunshot in the silence. The crying grew louder as they reached the bottom, pulling them toward the corner of the room where the fireplace stood. There, on the hearth, sat a small wooden cradle. Emily froze. The cradle hadn't been there before. "What the?" Derek whispered, taking a step closer. The cradle was antique, its dark wood polished to a high sheen. A quilt lay folded neatly over its side, and a mobile of tiny carved birds hung above it, gently spinning as if moved by an unseen breeze. The crying stopped. Emily felt her throat tighten. "Derek, we don't own a cradle." "I know," he said, his voice unsteady. "Someone's messing with us." But as he moved closer, the air in the room seemed to change. It grew heavy, oppressive, like a storm was about to break. Emily watched as Derek reached out to touch the cradle, his hand trembling. The instant his fingers brushed the wood, the crying started again, louder, more insistent, coming not from the cradle, but from all around them. Emily screamed as the fireplace erupted in a gust of cold air, scattering ashes across the room. Derek stumbled back, dropping the bat. The crying escalated into a wail that made Emily's ears ring. "Turn on the lights," she shouted, fumbling for the switch. The overhead light flickered on, and the sound stopped abruptly, leaving them in stunned silence. The cradle was gone. Derek swore under his breath, running a hand through his hair. "We're calling someone. A priest. A psychic. I don't care who." Emily didn't argue. Her gaze lingered on the spot where the cradle had been, her mind racing. It wasn't just fear gnawing at her, it was curiosity. Who had lived here before? And what had they left behind? Morning brought no comfort. Emily spent hours sifting through the few papers they had received from the real estate agent. The history of the house was sparse. Built in the 1930s, it had exchanged hands several times over the years. There were no red flags in the disclosures, no whispers of tragedy or scandal. "Anything?" Derek asked, sipping his third cup of coffee. She shook her head, frustration gnawing at her. "Nothing. Just the basics." Derek sighed, leaning against the kitchen counter. "Look, maybe this is just, I don't know, stress? New house jitters? We're both sleep-deprived." Emily shot him a look. "You think we hallucinated a cradle? The crying? The freezing air?" His face darkened. "No. I don't. But what am I supposed to say? Ghosts? Curses? Come on, Emily, this isn't a movie." Before she could respond, her phone buzzed. She glanced down to see a notification, new message from Lydia, "Welcome to the neighborhood." It was their next-door neighbor, a sweet older woman who had dropped by with cookies the day they moved in. Emily hesitated, then opened the message. "Hi, Emily. Hope you're settling in. If you ever want to chat about the house or the area, let me know. I've lived here a long time and know all the stories. Cheers, Lydia." Emily's stomach tightened. She replied immediately, "Hi, Lydia. Thanks for reaching out. Do you know anything unusual about our house?" Lydia's response came quickly. "I'd rather tell you in person. Can you come over?" Lydia's house was cozy and cluttered, the kind of place that smelled like lavender and cookies. She ushered Emily and Derek into her living room, where mismatched armchairs surrounded a low table cluttered with books and trinkets. "I wasn't sure if I should say anything," Lydia began, her hands folded in her lap. "I didn't want to scare you off. But you're not the first people to tell me about strange things in that house." Emily's breath hitched. "What kind of strange things?" Lydia hesitated, then reached for a photo album on the table. She flipped through its yellowed pages until she found what she was looking for, a black-and-white photo of a young couple standing on the porch of their house. "This is the Corwin family," she said. "They lived there in the late 1940s. Had a little boy named Henry." "What happened to them?" Derek asked. Lydia's voice softened. "Henry died when he was just a baby. They said he rolled out of his cradle one night and hit his head. After that, the parents, well, they didn't stay long. The mother was never the same. Some people say she thought she could still hear him crying." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. You think that's what we're hearing?" Lydia looked at her with a mixture of pity and fear. "I don't know. But I do know that house has always had a reputation. No one stays there long." The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Back at home, Emily paced the living room, her thoughts racing. Derek had retreated to his office, trying to distract himself with work, but she couldn't sit still. The rocking chair in the nursery seemed to call to her. She found herself standing in the doorway, staring at it, half expecting it to move on its own. "You were here when it happened, weren't you?" she whispered. "You saw it." The room was silent, but she felt something, a shift in the air, like the room itself was holding its breath. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing the arm of the chair. And then the crying began again. This time, it didn't come from nowhere. It came from the nursery closet. Her heart pounding, Emily moved to the closet door. Her hand shook as she reached for the knob, every nerve in her body screaming at her to stop. She opened it. Inside, the air was cold, so cold she could see her breath. The tiny space was empty save for a single object lying on the floor. A wooden rattle. She knelt down, picking it up with trembling hands. The wood was worn smooth, the paint faded, but it was unmistakably a baby's toy. As she held it, the crying stopped. But something else replaced it. A whisper. "Mama." Emily stumbled back, dropping the rattle. The whisper repeated, softer this time, almost pleading. "Mama." She backed out of the closet, slamming the door shut. The rattle remained on the floor, a silent accusation. Emily couldn't sleep. The whisper haunted her, an echo etched into her mind. Even with the closet door shut tight and a towel stuffed under the crack to block whatever energy emanated from inside, she felt the nursery breathing down the hallway. By 3 a.m., she found herself sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling untouched in her hands. Derek shuffled in moments later, his face drawn and tired. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. He shook his head, sitting across from her. "No. Every time I close my eyes, I hear it. The crying." Emily leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I found something in the nursery closet." Derek frowned. "What do you mean? What did you find?" She hesitated, glancing toward the stairs as if the house might be listening. "A rattle. A baby's rattle. It wasn't ours, Derek. It wasn't there before." His face darkened. "Where is it now?" "I left it there." Derek stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "We need to deal with this. Now." The nursery felt colder than the rest of the house. Emily hovered in the doorway as Derek walked inside, a flashlight in one hand and a crowbar in the other. "Do you really think smashing the closet is going to solve this?" she asked, her voice shaky. "If there's something hidden in the walls, I'm going to find it," he replied grimly. Derek yanked open the closet door, his breath fogging in the icy air. The rattle lay on the floor, exactly where Emily had left it. He picked it up, holding it in the beam of the flashlight. "Old," he muttered. "Hand-carved." He dropped it into an evidence bag he'd brought from the garage, as if handling a crime scene. Then, without hesitation, he drove the crowbar into the closet wall, splintering the wood. Emily winced at the noise. "Careful." Derek pried away a section of the wall, his flashlight cutting into the hollow space behind it. At first, there was nothing but dust and cobwebs. Then he reached inside and pulled something out. It was a bundle of cloth, brittle and stained with age. He carefully unwrapped it, revealing a small, rusted music box. "What is that?" Emily whispered, stepping closer. Derek turned the crank on the side of the box. It groaned as if protesting the motion, but then it began to play. The tune was soft, lilting, and achingly familiar, something Emily couldn't place but felt she'd heard before. The temperature in the room dropped sharply. Emily hugged herself as her breath fogged in the air. And then they heard it. A child's laughter. It came from behind them. They spun around, the flashlight beam sweeping the room, but nothing was there. The rocking chair creaked, slowly moving back and forth on its own. Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. "Derek, we need to stop." The music box wound down, the notes fading into silence. Derek nodded, his face pale. Yeah. Let's get out of here for tonight. In the light of day, everything felt less terrifying. But the music box stayed with Emily, its melody looping endlessly in her head. She spent hours searching online, combing through records of the Corwin family and their time in the house. Most of the information was mundane: birth certificates, marriage licenses, property deeds. But then she found it, a newspaper clipping from 1948. "Infant dies in accidental fall from cradle," the headline read. Her stomach twisted as she scanned the article. It was short and clinical, describing how baby Henry Corwin had slipped from his cradle one night while his parents slept. His death was ruled an accident. But there was a photograph attached to the article. It showed the nursery as it had been decades ago, with the same rocking chair and, Emily's breath caught, the same cradle. She leaned closer, her heart pounding. In the corner of the photo, barely visible, was the music box Derek had found. That evening, Derek came home to find Emily sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the music box. "This thing, it belonged to the Corwins," she said. "It was in the nursery the night Henry died." Derek ran a hand through his hair. "So what are you saying? That it's haunted? That the baby's spirit is still here?" Emily nodded, her eyes glassy. "I don't know. But I don't think it's just the baby. I think, there's something darker. Something keeping him here." Derek sat down beside her, his face grim. "So what do we do?" Emily hesitated. "We need to put it back." "Back where?" "In the wall." Derek stared at Emily, his expression shifting between disbelief and concern. "You want to put it back?" "Emily, we're not exactly dealing with a loose floorboard here. This is something we don't understand." Emily ran a hand through her hair, her voice trembling. "That's exactly why we have to put it back. The music box, the rattle, the cradle, they all belong to the past. We disturbed it, Derek. We woke it up." Derek looked down at the music box, its faded surface dull in the dim kitchen light. The idea of sealing it back into the closet wall felt like giving up, but he didn't have a better plan. "Fine," he said after a long silence. "We'll put it back." That night, the house seemed to resist their efforts. The wind howled against the windows, and the power flickered as they carried the music box upstairs to the nursery. Emily clutched the evidence bag containing the rattle, her knuckles white. "Do you feel that?" she whispered. Derek nodded. The air was thick, charged, as if the house were holding its breath. He approached the closet, flashlight in hand. The section of wall he'd torn away earlier gaped like an open wound. Emily held out the music box, her hand trembling as Derek took it from her. As he reached into the hollow space, the temperature dropped sharply, and the sound of crying filled the room once more. "No," Emily whispered, backing away. The sound grew louder, more desperate, until it was almost deafening. Derek shoved the music box and the rattle into the hole, but the crying didn't stop. Instead, the floorboards began to vibrate, a low, rhythmic pulse that seemed to come from deep within the house. "Seal it!" Emily shouted, her voice barely audible over the noise. Derek grabbed the plank of wood he'd pried loose and forced it back into place, hammering it into the frame with trembling hands. The moment it was secure, the crying stopped. For a few heartbeats, there was only silence. Then the rocking chair creaked. Emily turned to see it moving, slow and deliberate. Her breath caught as a shadow began to form in the chair, a dark, indistinct shape that seemed to flicker like a faulty projection. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. The shadow grew more defined, taking the shape of a woman cradling something in her arms. "Derek," Emily whispered. "Do you see that?" Derek turned, his face draining of color as he saw the figure. The woman's head tilted, her hollow eyes locking onto Emily's. "Why did you take him from me?" the figure rasped, her voice like wind through dry leaves. "We didn't," Emily cried, her voice breaking. We just found the music box." The shadow rose, its movements jerky and unnatural. The cradle appeared again, solid and gleaming, as if it had never vanished. The shadow placed the bundle in the cradle, then turned back toward them. "Leave this place," the shadow whispered. "Or join him." The room plunged into darkness, and the house trembled. They didn't speak as they drove to a motel on the edge of town, their bags hastily packed. Emily couldn't stop shaking, her mind replaying the events in the nursery over and over. "We're selling the house," Derek said, breaking the silence. Emily nodded. "First thing tomorrow." The motel room was small and unremarkable, but it was the first place Emily had felt safe in weeks. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the television, which was playing a rerun of a show she didn't recognize. Derek paced by the window, checking his phone every few minutes. "We can list the house as is," he said finally, breaking the silence. "We'll take a hit, but I don't care. We just need to be rid of it." Emily nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The shadow's words still echoed in her mind, "Leave this place, or join him." "It won't let us go," she said quietly. Derek stopped pacing. "What do you mean?" She turned to him, her eyes hollow. "Whatever's in that house, it doesn't want us to leave. It doesn't want the music box hidden, it wants something else." Derek frowned. "We put everything back. It should be over." "Maybe it isn't about putting it back," Emily said, her voice trembling. "Maybe it's about finishing what was started. Maybe Henry's spirit is still trapped because of her." Derek sank onto the bed beside her, his hands on his knees. "What are you saying?" "That we need to, what? Confront it? Exorcise it?" "I don't know," Emily admitted. "But we can't sell the house like this. Not if someone else is going to move in and," her voice broke. "We have to do something." They returned to the house at dawn. The air inside was heavy, oppressive. The floors groaned beneath their feet as if the house were alive, aware of their presence. Emily carried the music box, and Derek had the rattle. They moved through the house like intruders, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The nursery was waiting for them. The rocking chair sat still, but its presence felt menacing. The cradle was back, as solid and real as if it had never disappeared. Emily set the music box on the floor in front of the cradle. Derek placed the rattle beside it. "What now?" Derek asked, his voice tight. Emily hesitated. "We ask her to let him go." Derek gave her a skeptical look but said nothing. Emily knelt before the cradle, her hands trembling. "We're sorry," she said, her voice soft. "We didn't mean to disturb you. But Henry doesn't belong here anymore. He deserves peace, and so do you." The air shifted, colder than before. The shadow appeared again, rising from the rocking chair like smoke. The woman's form was clearer now, her face gaunt and hollow, her eyes twin voids of sorrow. "You don't understand," the figure rasped, her voice carrying centuries of pain. "He was taken from me." Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "It wasn't your fault. He fell. It was an accident." The shadow froze, as if the words struck a chord. "No," the figure whispered, her voice breaking. "No, it wasn't." The room seemed to shift, and a vision played out before them, a phantom reenactment of the past. The cradle stood in the center of the room, and a young woman knelt beside it, sobbing. Her face was pale and gaunt, her hands clutching the empty air where the baby should have been. A man stood over her, his face contorted with rage. "You let him die," the man shouted, his voice venomous. "You weren't watching him. This is your fault." The woman shook her head, cradling the invisible child. "I didn't. I didn't." The man raised his hand, and the vision dissolved into darkness. The shadow turned to Emily, her hollow eyes gleaming with unshed tears. "He took him," she whispered. "He took Henry from me and blamed me. And now I can't find him. I can't find my baby." Emily's heart broke. "He's gone," she said gently. "Henry's gone. You don't have to keep searching." You can let go. The shadow hesitated, flickering like a dying flame. The temperature began to rise, the oppressive heaviness lifting. Go to him, Emily said, her voice steady. He's waiting for you. The shadow reached out, her form softening, and for a moment, Emily thought she saw the outline of a baby in her arms. Then the figure faded, dissolving into the light streaming through the window. The house felt different after that, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. The cradle and the rocking chair were gone, leaving the nursery empty but no longer menacing. Emily and Derek sold the house a few weeks later, leaving behind the memories of their ordeal. As they drove away for the last time, Emily glanced back at the house. For the first time, it looked like what it was supposed to be, a home, ready for a new beginning. And somewhere, she hoped, Henry and his mother had found theirs too. Months had passed since Emily and Derek left the house, but the memories clung to Emily like a second skin. In the quiet of their new apartment, she often found herself awake at night, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sound she prayed she'd never hear again. But the silence wasn't comforting. It felt like the edge of something unfinished. One evening, while unpacking a final box from the move, she found something she didn't remember packing. Her breath caught as she pulled it out, a faded, hand-carved wooden rattle. Derek, she called, her voice tight. He came from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. What's wrong? She held up the rattle. This. It was in the nursery. I thought we left it in the house. Derek frowned, taking the rattle from her. That's impossible. We sealed everything back up before we left. Then how is it here? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Derek's face darkened. Maybe the movers found it somewhere and thought it was ours? Emily shook her head, backing away. No. This doesn't feel right. Derek, I think, she trailed off, unable to finish the thought. But the thought finished itself. It's not over. That night, Emily woke to the sound of the rattle. The soft clinking filled the room, rhythmic and deliberate. She turned on the bedside lamp, her heart pounding as she scanned the room. The rattle sat on the dresser, unmoving, but the sound persisted. She shook Derek awake. It's happening again, she said, her voice trembling. He sat up, groggy and alarmed. What's happening? The sound stopped. The room was deathly silent. Emily grabbed the rattle and hurled it into the kitchen trash can, her hands trembling. We're getting rid of it tomorrow. I don't care how. Derek didn't argue. The next morning, they drove to a remote area by the river and tossed the rattle into the rushing water. Emily watched it disappear beneath the surface, a strange sense of relief washing over her. But that night, the sound returned. A faint rattling, like bones shaking in a hollow drum, drifted through the apartment. Emily and Derek both heard it this time, and they sat up in bed, the fear in their eyes mirrored in each other. It's not the rattle, Derek said. Emily nodded slowly, her heart sinking. It's her. Desperate for answers, they reached out to a local medium recommended by Lydia. The woman, Marta, arrived the following evening, her presence calm but commanding. She carried a bag of tools, candles, incense, and a small wooden box covered in carvings. You're dealing with a restless spirit, Marta said, after Emily and Derek recounted their experience. She's attached to you now. She thinks you can help her. We did help her, Derek insisted. We helped her move on. Marta lit a candle, the flame flickering as if in response to his words. She believes her child is still missing. Until she finds him, she won't rest. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. But her son is gone. We saw her, let go. Marta gave her a long, searching look. Are you sure? Marta conducted a séance that night, asking Emily and Derek to sit with her in a circle around the wooden box. The apartment seemed to shrink as the séance began, the air growing thick and heavy. The candlelight flickered wildly, casting strange shadows on the walls. Marta's voice was low and steady. To the spirit bound to this family, I call to you. Why do you linger? What do you seek? The air grew colder, and the faint sound of crying filled the room. Emily clutched Derek's hand, her heart pounding. Marta's head tilted, as if listening to a voice they couldn't hear. Her eyes widened. She says, her child is here. No, Emily whispered. That's not possible. Marta's expression darkened. She doesn't mean physically. She says part of him remains, with you. Emily's mind raced. The rattle? Marta shook her head. No. Something else. Something that belonged to him. Derek frowned. We got rid of everything. We left it all in the house. Marta's eyes flicked toward Emily. Are you sure? Emily's chest tightened. She remembered the music box, the tune that had lingered in her mind, unshakable. It had felt so familiar, like a lullaby her mother used to hum. I know that song, she said suddenly. What do you mean? Derek asked. Tears welled in her eyes. My mother used to hum it to me when I was little. But she said she didn't make it up, she heard it from her mother. Realization dawned like a punch to the gut. Emily's voice trembled. I think I'm connected to her. To the Corwins. Somehow. Marta leaned forward, her voice urgent. You must help her find what she's looking for. Only then will this end. Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. How? The candle flickered, and Marta's voice dropped to a whisper. You must return to where it all began. Emily didn't want to go back. The thought of stepping into that house again, of feeling its walls close in and its shadows watching, was unbearable. But as Marta's words echoed in her mind, she knew they had no choice. You must return to where it all began. By the next morning, Emily and Derek were standing on the overgrown lawn of their former home. The house loomed before them, its windows dark and lifeless. The new owners weren't scheduled to move in for weeks, leaving it empty and eerily silent. Ready? Derek asked, his voice tight. Emily swallowed hard and nodded. The house felt colder than they remembered. Dust covered the floors, and faint scratches marked the walls where furniture had been moved out. The nursery was the same. Empty. Still. The memories of what had happened there weighed heavy in the air, like a storm waiting to break. Marta had instructed them to bring the music box. Though Emily had tried to leave it behind, it had inexplicably reappeared in her belongings the day after they'd moved. Now, she carried it in her hands, its presence both a comfort and a curse. Derek set up a circle of candles in the center of the nursery, as Marta had instructed. Emily placed the music box within the circle, her hands trembling. Now what? Derek asked, lighting the final candle. Emily sat cross-legged on the floor, staring at the music box. We call to her. We tell her the truth. The words felt strange as they left her lips, but she spoke them anyway. I know who you are, Emily said softly, her voice trembling. You're looking for Henry. But he's gone. And you can't bring him back. The air in the room grew colder. The rocking chair, long absent, materialized in the corner, its wood gleaming in the dim candlelight. A shadow began to form. Emily's breath caught as the woman appeared, her face gaunt and sorrowful, her hollow eyes fixed on the music box. You don't understand, the figure rasped. He's here. I can feel him. Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. He's not here. But you left something behind, a piece of him. This music box, this room, they keep you tied to this place. The shadow recoiled, as if in pain. Derek stepped forward, his voice firm. It's time to let go. You've been searching for decades, but Henry is waiting for you, somewhere better than this. The woman's form wavered, flickering like a dying flame. Why did he leave me? She whispered, her voice breaking. Emily's heart ached. She stepped closer, her hand outstretched. He didn't leave you. He's waiting. Go to him. The woman stared at her for a long moment, then turned toward the cradle that had reappeared in the corner of the room. A soft, flickering light began to emanate from it, growing brighter with each passing second. A child's laughter echoed through the room, warm and pure. The shadow moved toward the cradle, her form softening as she reached for the light. For the first time, Emily thought she saw a smile on her face. And then she was gone. The light faded, taking the cradle and the rocking chair with it. The room grew warmer, the oppressive weight lifting as sunlight streamed through the window. They left the house for the last time that afternoon. As they drove away, Emily felt a strange sense of peace. "It's over," she said, her voice steady. Derek glanced at her, his expression softening. "You think she found him?" Emily nodded, a faint smile on her lips. "I do." That night, as Emily drifted off to sleep in their new apartment, she thought she heard the faintest sound of a lullaby, the melody of the music box, carried on the wind. It wasn't frightening. It was goodbye.